Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR tutorial series, where you learn by watching other VR, AR, and MR professionals create the magic. I'm Marshall Anschutz, an immersive content specialist focused on e-learning and training. I'm also the creator and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest creator today is Marshall Anschutz, a VR software and hardware creator with over 5 years of experience. Marshall has created hardware prototypes of the Samsung Gear 360 camera, as well as helped Samsung scale their early VR video platform, SamsungVR. Today, Marshall will be showing us how to set up a Unity project for using the HTC Vive headset and controllers. But before we get started, I want to remind you to register at howtocreatevr.com. It's free, and registration gives you access to all of our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more. It's quick and easy. Just visit howtocreatevr.com and click on the Register for Free button. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltspaceVR and subscribe to our channel. All right, Marshall, welcome to the tutorial series.
Thanks for having me on today.
I'm glad to have you here. It's very exciting. You're going to be showing us how to create a Unity project for the HTC Vive, and also you will be doing a different tutorial later on for the following week on how to do the same thing on the Oculus Rift. So that's very cool of you to do that.
Yes, I'm excited about showing y'all.
Cool. Well, why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your background? You told me that you worked for Samsung or created a prototype for the Samsung Gear 360. So maybe you can explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, back even before the first headsets were released from Samsung, we were working on a camera prototype. And it was really fun being able to 3D print models and actually take several phones together to try to do the full 360 video. We were trying to see if we could use two cameras on the outside of the phones and actually synchronize those together to create 360 video. Eventually became the Gear 360 camera, and fortunately didn't require you to buy two phones, but it was fun to be able to see how the hardware came together and the transition over several months of that project.
That must have been cool to work on. You do both hardware and software. You say, do you prefer one over the other one?
I've always billed myself as a software person, but whenever you do a project, sometimes you need to think outside the box and not say, okay, here's my hammer, which for me tends to be software, and say, I'm only going to solve it using software. So it's always fun when a situation comes up when you can use, whether it's a little Arduino board or build a whole new software platform, or just find a way to hook things up in a different way to be able to solve a problem for people. I think that's what drives me in my desire to learn about virtual reality, is it's not just a normal monitor. So yeah, I'm excited to see how we can push the boundaries of both software and the hardware to create more interactive and immersive experiences.
So do you have an engineering background?
I've pretty much taught myself everything that I've learned between researching on the internet or just playing around with things. That's how I've learned.
That's awesome. Great. Well, Marshall, I'm excited to see how to set up a project in Unity for the HTC Vive, so I'll let you get started, and if I have any questions, I'll jump right in.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's create a virtual reality project in Unity 2018. You can see I've downloaded on my machine already the 2018.3 release. That is the latest one here in 2019. But any of the releases should be the same instructions as well as for 2019. It's the first version that Unity introduced their new XR-compatible plugins for virtual and mixed reality. Earlier versions, Unity 5 or anything before 2018, will not have the same instructions as this. So for creating our new project, we're going to hit New here in the Unity Hub, and it will give you an option to name your project. We're going to call this the Vive example, and we're using a 2018 version. Our template is going to be 3D. There's also the VR lightweight render pipeline, which has some really fun features to give extra performance, but it requires some extra work to get the textures to map properly. So we're going to use the 3D version for now.
So does that mean that in general, people will be picking the 3D template versus the other one?
For right now, I think that's going to be the easiest to get started. If you have a really complex scene, the lightweight render pipeline will give you a lot more performance. But for the sake of a tutorial, they both have the same instructions to get VR started. But the render pipeline just requires a lot more work because the defaults are set up for the 3D template.
That makes sense. Cool.
Okay, so let's create this project. It's just now loaded the scene in. You don't have to select anything for the analytics section. That uses Unity's servers to get a general overview of your analytics on your platform whenever it's installed on different user systems. But you can either choose to enable that or disable it based on your preference for the project. For something simple like this, it doesn't really matter either way.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that when I saw that in settings. So is that mainly for tracking, what kind of analytics does it track, just for curiosity's sake?
Yeah, Unity tracks app open, duration. I believe they also can track exceptions, any type of errors in your code, crashes they can report back to you.
I see.
I'm not sure exactly which things are in part of their free platform as well as their paid. So if you're building a commercial platform, a commercial game or something, that would be something you definitely want to look into.
Right. Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now that we have a basic 3D scene, we need to install our HTC Vive, which is also the open VR platform. We need to install those assets. And so we're going to go to the Assets Store and search for Steam VR. And you will see there's a Steam VR plugin from Valve. And sometimes you'll hit either, for a new project, you'll hit Install, which will be this pink button. Or if it's been a while and there's an upgrade, you'll hit Upgrade. And after you do that, it'll go back to an Upgrade button, which is really confusing. You may have to exit the Asset Store by clicking the little tab here and then go back to Window, go to the Asset Store and search again, and then it'll show an Import button. If that doesn't work, you may try restarting your Unity project and then come back to the Import button. So importing this package, you will see a whole bunch of different files here. Don't bother checking or unchecking different ones. Just make sure that all are selected and hit Import.
And as you mentioned before that there may be an update, do you recommend after you set up your project and you have your asset package imported already that you continuously check for updates or not really?
If you're using source control to version your code, I would make sure that you commit all your code, then go check for an update and download it and make sure everything works from there, and then commit again. That way, if for some reason the latest version of the plugin, sometimes they actually remove old modules. The Steam VR one in particular has a controller object that would take care of your hand controllers and give you button inputs. We'll get to that later on how to do that instead. But they used to have a whole module for that got removed in the latest versions. That would be really destructive if you didn't have any sort of version control. So if you are not using it, I would recommend just sticking with the same version for a while. But using version control really helps.
So their way of working, it's not by deprecating a module and leaving it in there. It's just literally removing it. And if your code breaks, your code breaks.
Exactly. There's a very fast iteration time for virtual reality.
Right.
Everything here is still somewhat experimental.
Right.
And some things are still just reaching version 1 here several years after release.
Right. That makes sense.
So one of the fun things here with the VR plugin from Steam is that it gives you this window only the first time really that you import the plugin to your project. And so they're going to give you some options here to customize your project. There is a different amount of options if you have the paid version of Unity. Some of those work, but for right now we can use these. So first one is display resolution. We're going to hide that by default. And that's when you build the app. The actual Windows executable just starts running. The second one is to disable the resizable window, and you can disable that as well for the app. And the final one is using linear color space. So we're going to hit that. Linear color space works a little bit better for virtual reality just because of the processing time on the graphics card. Here, I'll show you. The other final one would be the Unity splash screen. If you're using the free version of Unity, you cannot disable that. If you have the paid version, you probably would want to disable the splash screen as well. Now we've got our Vive plugin installed, and we need to configure our project settings. So the project settings is where you can configure things such as button inputs and all of the different virtual reality settings. We are going to go to the player section here and scroll down to XR settings, which is Unity's mixed reality section. You'll see here that virtual reality SDKs, that we have OpenVR. That is the one for the HTC Vive. And there's also a few other headsets that this tutorial or your app would be compatible with. Oculus is enabled on here as well. If you don't see that, that's all right. If you're not targeting Oculus, check our other tutorial out for those details. but it is okay if you have both of those enabled. And really the order does not matter unless if you have someone who has both headsets connected at once. For now, we're going to leave the stereo rendering mode at multipass and not enable any of the other augmented reality settings. The final setting that we need to adjust here is, of course, you can change your bundle to give it a nice name for the project. We also have to change our scripting runtime version to be .NET 4 and Mono as the backend, and API compatibility needs to be set to .NET 4.x. Now, when you do that, it's going to recompile a bunch of assets, which may take a few seconds on your machine. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, we have laid the foundation for Unity to be able to build an HTC Vive compatible application. In Unity, we build everything in the context of a scene. Let's build a simple one to show off our skills. So in our asset area, we're going to right-click and say create a scene. There is a default scene in your project, but we're going to call this one My Vive Scene, and then double click on it. We'll bring up, you can see here on the left side in your hierarchy, we have several default objects, a camera and a directional light. Because we're doing virtual reality, we need to delete the main camera. So you can press delete or just click it here from the menu. And now we're going to add a few objects. The first one you'll find in our asset pack. Under examples, you will see here, I've pulled it up, there's a folder called Rocket. And inside of it, we have an FBX file and a JPEG, which is a texture. I downloaded these from a Sketchfab project that had it licensed for any use. And so we're going to bring these in just as a fun example. We're going to take the folder and drop it here inside our assets. And you will see that there's now a Rocket folder, and inside it has Rocket and the texture. Now they're not linked together. If you open it up, you can see there's a texture and the actual mesh. So we're going to click on the rocket ship over there and look on our inspector. There's a section for materials, and we can actually extract the materials. And you'll see texture. Now clicking on texture, there's a section called albedo, which is basically the color of the material. In Unity, you can drag a texture, a JPEG or something, into the little square, and that will map the JPEG into the color channel. The rocket ship already has their UV textures mapped, so we'll click on it, and we can do an on-demand remap from our texture, and we should be able to hit search and remap and have the object applied back onto it. So now that we have our rocket ship, we can drag one into the scene and move it around to give us something fun to look at in the scene. Also, when you're doing virtual reality, it's a good object to create a plane to get started that is our floor. For that, we're also going to create another texture. We can do it up here in just the main section to start with. Normally, you'd want to organize your assets based on scenes or by type of object. But for right now, we're just going to create a quick texture by going to create material. And we can do just a normal opaque material. And we'll set the albedo now to, let's do a dark green to maybe simulate the grass in our scene. We can drag this material just straight onto the object, and Unity will apply it. You'll see here now the rocket ship is falling through the ground. Okay, so now we have some basic objects in the scene, and we need to import our real camera. It's a little bit tricky to find it in the Steam VR folder of our assets. Let's open that up, and we're going to go into the interaction system folder. When you click on that, you'll see there's several different objects like longbow. Those are for the example projects, but those assets won't be included in your project if you don't use them. We're going to go instead to the core and click on prefabs, and you'll see in here there is a player object. Let's just drag that into our scene, and voila, we have a fully working Vive headset and controllers and all of that stuff put into our scene.
Does it really matter if the player is down like the fourth item there or above everybody else? Does that affect the project at all?
No, It should not affect the project. The player can actually be anywhere in the scene, and Unity will still render it just fine. The thing that would matter is if you put it inside of another object. So we could nest the player inside of the plane, which it should still work, but then if the plane moves, it would actually transport the player object as well.
Right.
You could use that if you were doing different types of simulations, such as maybe a car or a train, that you wanted to move the scene. You wanted to move the player inside of a vehicle.
Right, so you move the plane. Right.
Yes.
You move the vehicle and the player moves with it.
Exactly. So let's see if we can get it out. And now we should be able to use our player normally. So now that we can see our scene, here we're going to test it out. And we'll click on the play button, which will connect to your Vive. The first time that you do this, it's actually going to ask if we would like to generate our inputs, and we'll go over more of these later. So I'm going to skip it for now, and they're going to ask a few times, but we can go ahead and do that. So now you'll see if I put on my headset that nothing works. If you're actually in the headset, you would see that it had some error messages as well. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you have to actually restart your project for it to get working. So we're going to do that now. Okay, so we restarted the app and it's still not working. Sometimes you have to play with these VR controls. They sometimes change per release of the input widgets and how exactly they need to be configured. But let's try again. And this time we're going to actually set up our input controls. And we do want to generate this actions.json file from the example. And you'll see here that there's several different action sets. These action sets are fine as a default. So we can click Save and Generate, and it will create all of our scripts. It also has to compile, and it should be done now. So now you can see that when I put on my headset, that there's my controllers. So I'm going to grab one of these, wave to you and say hi. You look around, there's a rocket ship over here. Look at it. We can not interact with it or anything, but it is there. Gives us a frame of reference.
And with that, you can actually teleport as well, or at least use locomotion to physically move?
You can physically move. Locomotion is something that you do have to set up and configure.
Got it. But physically you can move?
You can physically move around, yes.
Got it. If you want to do teleporting or any other kind of locomotion, you'll have to set that up separately.
Correct. And so we're going to stop the scene before we do anything else. It's important that you stop it, or everything that you modify will be removed as soon as you stop the scene. So now that we have set up our scene in the head-mounted display and looked at it, we can move on to add some interactivity to the project. Let's see if we can use our touch controllers now in this scene. One of the first things we need to do is to create a game controller in our scene. This is something that you would want to add not over here in the hierarchy, but on our actual asset area. We're going to create a C# script, and we'll call this Vive Game Controller. And we can then drag this into the project. In just a second, let's do that. First, we need to create the asset in Visual Studio, which may take a few seconds on your machine to start up and compile the first time, and then you're able to edit. So I have the sample code for this also in our example, but we're going to go through some of the key points a line at a time, and then we'll add it into our scene. The first thing that you need is to add several public variables, and we're going to do Steam VR action Boolean, and you'll see here that it doesn't recognize it. So we're going to go up here first and say using valve.vr and using valve.vr.interaction system. We can autocomplete that here. Now those will keep you from having to type those before every single variable name or action. So now that we have that, there's another function that we need called onEnable. And that allows us to basically, whenever this component is been turned on in the scene, it will perform an action. And since the controllers are dynamic and they can come and go, using onEnable allows us to toggle this on and off. I'll paste it here so that we can look at it. It allows us to take our hand, which is the controller, and save it into our scene. So let's add that variable, public hand, which is another Valve specific object. And now that will get enabled. And then the third object that we're going to load in is game object, which is a generic term in Unity for an object inside your game. We're going to call this projectile. And that is what we're going to fire with our controllers in the scene whenever we press a button.
And that's for the rocket?
Yes, that will be for our rocket. Now we can also add, whenever we're done with our enable, we need to disable somehow and clean up after ourselves. So on disable, it will remove the change listener that we apply here. So the change listener is what we listen on whenever this hand object changes. And we've set this up, basically, it'll be a single button press on the controller, is why it's called a Boolean, because it has either a press or a non-press. And so SteamVR has kind of given us some easy objects rather than polling and keeping state of the buttons and mapping if they've, from the last state to the current state, what's changed. They've given us this easy object called a Boolean that tells us if the button presses or unpresses. Let's go ahead and write the onMyActionChange function. So this is a private function, void because it doesn't return anything, onMyActionChange. And we're going to use a SteamVR action Boolean, which is going to be called action in. That's the action coming into the system. SteamVR input sources has an underscore there, and this is input sources. That allows us to know which input sources are in the scene, as well if we need to correlate something like a button press from a different controller and verify. And then finally, our new value. And inside of this function, we're going to just check if new value is true. Or you can just omit the true because that's implied. And if so, then we're going to instantiate a new projectile using the projectile that we pass in as a reference. And this is a Unity default function called instantiate, allowing you to create dynamic things in your scene. Maybe you could do some other action here like cause an object to wave or disappear. But for this project, we're just going to have it add new objects in. We need to take our hand that was defined in the scene, which is our controller, grab the transform of it, and take the position, as well as hand.transform.rotation, which is a very important thing there to keep track of. That's the three-dimensional space and the orientation of the controller. We're going to take that and map it to the projectile so that we can see that we're actually capturing where the controller is in 3D space, and we'll use that for the rocket ship. So now with all this stuff set up, we should be able to use this in our scene. So the easiest way to do this is to create an empty, which will make a game object. And now we can parent our script onto that game object. You can also do it over here under Add Component. Click here and you could type in and search for it that way. You can add several different scripts onto an object. For this one, we only need this one script. You'll notice that the actions that we have here, the properties, are mapped from all of the public variables, the three different ones we have. We are going to choose Interact UI, which is the main button press on the trigger, and we can choose a hand, and you'll see there's a left, right, and a fallback, which probably isn't necessary. I'm left-handed, so I'm going to choose left hand. You could choose either one, or you may actually need to add both hands into your scene to grab actions from different controllers. And finally, we're going to choose our projectile, which is not in the scene, it's an asset. And we'll type in rocket and choose our rocket ship. So now one thing we may want to do over here on our rocket is actually change the model. We'll scale our scale factor down to 0.25 just for this object, it looks a little bit more manageable. We're not inside of the rocket ship. We're wanting to see a bunch of them. And that's applied globally, so our hand will pick it up. Now that we have all these things set up, let's preview our scene and see what we can see here. Your scene should start up. If you put the controller on, the headset on, you should see your little bitty rocket ship and also see your controllers. This looks like my left hand. So let's see if we can press that button right here. And boom, we have a rocket ship. You can add several more here into the scene, and you can create a whole firing line of rocket ships.
And literally what it's doing, it's cloning the object, basically.
Yes, it's cloning that template object.
Every time you click the trigger.
Exactly. And you can see here, even if you take your thumb, you move it around on here, the controller actually responds somewhat realistically. There's a button on the side. You can press.
And that's all built in.
And that all comes for free with the Vive player object.
Now, the first time you clicked on the trigger, it didn't clone it. It moved it to where it transformed it into the location where your hand was. But the second time, oh no, it did clone it. There it is. Got it. Okay. Yeah. I was wondering about that. Okay, no, that makes sense. So it's not really, so it clones it and moves it into wherever your hand is.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what's 0, position in your hand? In other words, when you click on the trigger, where is it actually placing? Do you know what I'm asking? Where is it actually placing it within your hand?
Let's look at that here. So you can see on all of these cloned rocket ships, your transforms, these numbers are fixed from your controller.
I see. And
the rotation, the scale is the same, but transform, the other two parts of the transform are there. So each one of these has a different position and rotation from the default scene. One thing that we can look at here is the player object. We have to open up Don't Destroy on Load, Player, and then you can see the Steam VR objects. If you actually open that up, I'll pull left hand as an example here.
Oh, it's live. You can see.
So I'll pull up. If you watch, when I move it, you can see it move. And these are world space.
Right.
So it's important there that you don't have any additional transforms. If you were embedding this inside another object and doing a transform, you would need to apply that transform as well to get world space.
So do me a favor, click on the trigger bar, hold on to it, don't let go. So you see how the rocket appeared at the top of the controller. What if you want it closer to the hand? Do you have to transform minus a certain X, Y, and Z variable?
Yeah, for that you would have to. Okay. This is particular to the Vive controllers. They consider the circle inside as kind of
the 0 point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, if you think of a drawing app, that would be kind of like the middle.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Something.
Right.
There are different skins that you can use for these controllers, like different hands, and there's also new knuckle controllers coming out, and those would have a different origin on them as well.
Right.
But it's best to use whatever they consider as the origin of the controller. Mm-hmm. It may seem a little bit funky, but you have the best chance of having interoperability with different controllers.
But for example, if you wanted to move the origin, you just use math, whatever X, Y, and Z, you add, subtract, multiply, whatever math you want to use.
Yeah, you could do that inside of your C# code before you instantiate the object.
Yep, that makes sense. Cool.
Mm-hmm. So, and you can look into your scene here. You can investigate your VR camera. You can see the position here as I'm moving it around rather dramatically through space. And you can see how it's transforming. So this is a good way to debug your VR scene, is to run it and then start inspecting. Also, one thing that we didn't touch before is the console. It gives you debugging instructions here. And you can also add debug statements into your code, which we should be able to pull up right here. There is, for instance, debug.log error would log out into that console if it wasn't able to do something. So those are some of the key ways that you can use to kind of troubleshoot and work through your scene. One thing I think I want to show also is while it's running, you can choose Steam VR Input Live View, and that will bring up a very fancy control dashboard that shows all of your controllers. And so for instance here, if you look at Interact UI, it says false. When I press down the trigger button, try to position it here. When I create, you see it says true. Then when I release, it says false. And so that's allowing you to inspect those different actions and find out which ones you need to listen on. If you press, for instance, this, it changes the teleport. Your button down on the side is grab, pinch. And so you can control those things. And you can also adjust those actions inside of the buttons panel, which shows up right here as Steam VR input. Allows us to go back and remap our buttons. Okay, now that we've finished setting up our scene and our inputs, let's build this into a Windows executable to release to our friends and customers. So we'll close out all of our input mappings, and we're going to go to the Edit menu and Project Settings, and just double check here. This is where you would add your icons, all of those other things that you need to make it a real application. If you have a paid version of Unity, you can customize your splash image or have that disabled. And then you go to File and select your build settings. The build settings is where you are able to configure what actually gets built for the app. We've got lots of extra Steam assets that aren't going to show up in our actual project. So it needs to know which scene. Because our scene's open right now, we can just click Add Open Scenes, and it will build this scene. Our target platform is going to be Windows. 64-bit is definitely a good thing. If you have a paid version of Unity, you can build on the server, and you may want to do a development build if you're into debugging your code with debuggers. But for now, these settings should work. One thing to note is it will not build a universal Windows platform app with the Vive controller stuff in the default format. That would take a little bit more work. So we're going to build a regular standalone Windows application. When we hit build, we need to select a folder for it. And so we are going to actually create a new folder and call this build. That's a project. And inside of here, it's going to build our project for us and create a Windows executable.
And I'm assuming it's naming the file My Vive Scene.
Yes.
Okay.
The My Vive Scene should be the project. It should be named based on the project name that you choose at the beginning, because you can actually add multiple different scenes. Now you can see we have here in our Explorer window, it gives us a Vive example.exe, which I believe is the name of the Unity project. You can customize it in the settings or just leave it as a default. Now that you see the app here in the Windows Explorer, you can ship this app to your friends or upload it on the web, but double-clicking on it will start it up, and you'll see it run inside of your headset.
And I'm assuming, and this probably is a lot more complicated than this, but I'm assuming this is sort of the app that, or the executable that you would submit to like Steam Valve.
Yes. So you would take this app, you would upload it to their developer portal,
right?
And then they would run it through their tests, and it would become an actual game on their store.
On early release, and then you would make millions of dollars, and we'd all be happy.
Exactly.
Yes.
So now we've created a fully functioning VR executable. It's got the controllers, it's got button interactivity, and it works most importantly with the HTC Vive.
Marshall, thanks for participating in this tutorial today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
If people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give a URL or a Twitter or contact, whatever you like?
Yeah, they can reach me on my website is unwritten.media. And there's also links there to follow us on Twitter. I tweet a lot. I also lurk on Facebook under the 360 and VR, several of those different groups.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Marshall. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you're here with us. Just a quick reminder, if you want to access all of our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more, register for free at howtocreatevr.com. Finally, if you want to attend our live events in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltspaceVR and subscribe to our channel. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.